Thailand's Defense Minister Gen. Prawit Wongsuwon, U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis and Singapore's Defense Minister Gen attend an informal lunch meeting at ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting in Singapore. Southeast Asian navies are heading to their first joint exercises with China, and defense officials agreed to conduct a similar drill with the U.S. next year. AP photo, Wong, file. The U.S. and China's relationship is quickly deteriorating, and is likely to result in all trade getting hit with tariffs by early next year. But that is just the beginning of a confrontation that is moving beyond trade to include conflicts in the South China Sea, cyber hacking and high-tech espionage. Recent U.S. administration pronouncements that broadly snuck under the radar openly characterize China as a national security threat. This escalation in trade and military tensions runs the risk of unraveling global economic growth, growing naval aggression and national security threats. On October 4, U.S. Vice President Mike Pence spoke at the Hudson Institute and delivered a blistering attack on China. Railed on China's suspected efforts to interfere in the upcoming midterm elections. He highlighted recent provocations in the South China Sea, as a Chinese vessel tried to block a U.S. destroyer in international waters, which narrowly avoided a collision. That same day, Peter Navarro, a trade advisor to the U.S. president, ran an op-ed piece in the New York Times. He outlined a Department of Defense report that highlighted vulnerabilities in military manufacturing. It specifically identified China as a significant national security risk in supplying critical materials. He emphasized that an immediate next step would be to improve domestic fuel cell and battery production to support underwater vehicles. This seemed like a veiled reference to improving capabilities in the South China Sea. On that same day, Bloomberg reported a chilling story of Chinese espionage, as stealth chips were inserted into U.S.-bound hardware. The chips were installed by operatives of the People's Liberation Army with the intent of spying, according to multiple sources from the intelligence and business community. This new characterization and public pronouncement of China as a significant U.S. national security threat is a seismic shift in the relationship. Poison pill. In another sign that the U.S. is looking to isolate China, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, trade agreement includes a provision that restricts new trade deals with non-market economies. While not explicitly named, this was primarily aimed at China. The U.S. demands that Mexico or Canada notify it of any talks with China, and, if a deal were completed, then the U.S. can walk away from the USMCA agreement. The U.S. argues that this prevents China from avoiding tariffs by accessing the U.S. through indirect routes. Days later, Wilbur Ross, the U.S. Commerce Secretary, called the clause kind of a poison pill, and indicated the U.S. would look to insert this into new agreements with the EU and Japan as well. Putting on a military show in September, China did something unprecedented by conducting military drills with Russia. This show of cooperation and military strength was to remind the U.S. that adversaries could bury their differences and mount an offensive. Russia and China are reluctant allies. Russia may be trying to persuade the U.S. to lift sanctions by flouting a willingness to adopt China. Meanwhile, China, fearing that the U.S. will consolidate international support to contain its trade and influence, wants to demonstrate its willingness to align with a U.S. adversary. Not to be outdone, the U.S. is expected to showcase its military might with an exercise in November. While details are scant, the exercise is likely to be concentrated in the South China Sea. However, it may include South America, where China is heavily investing in trade and political relations, and the North Sea, to remind Russia that the U.S. can support a global confrontation. U.S. ramping up soft power. One of Xi Jinping's signature initiatives has been the One Belt, One Road global infrastructure program to connect China to Europe and Northern Africa. Now, the U.S. is stepping up with its own Build Act to counter China's influence in nation-building. The U.S. and China are quickly expanding the scope of their confrontation, making it very difficult to de-escalate trade differences, raising the risk of a serious miscalculation. China may also align more substantially with Russia, creating a multipolar world. Geopolitical risk to markets. Markets need to pay more attention to this changing landscape. We could soon start to see multiple rounds of brinkmanship, as neither leader is politically constrained. In the U.S., President Trump has significant executive powers relating to trade and national security, and, across both political parties, China is viewed as a threat. Meanwhile, China recently changed its constitution to allow President Xi Jinping to hold his job for life. Global trade uncertainty will increase as conflicts escalate in the South China Sea, a $4 trillion hub for international trade. Asian trade and supply chains are at risk of disruption, which would increase global market volatility. While U.S. companies will look to manage around any supply chain breakdowns, delays and inefficiencies will invariably impact profits. Extended conflicts are a serious risk to long-term growth, as trade spheres of influence could become more bifurcated. For example, if China were to trade more with emerging markets while the U.S. focuses on trading with the developed world, aggregate trade would drop. This poses a serious risk to markets that have not yet factored it into pricing. This material contains opinions of the author, but not necessarily those of Sun Life Financial or its subsidiaries and/or affiliates.